welcome to TorchTech. I'm Max Whitney. I work in Central ITS in the Academic Technology Services group. But really, I'm here just as one member of TorchTech. TorchTech is a grassroots initiative to kickstart our global IT community. It's got three really big goals. We try and foster collaboration to build people networks rather than what we usually do during the day, which is build physical networks that go to Shanghai and Abu Dhabi and back here, and to share knowledge. Today's event was actually a suggestion that came directly from the community, and the topic is how technology is changing the way we work. And that's something that directly impacts every single one of us. So welcome, and thank you for making the time in your day. I wanted to point out that we have two more upcoming events from TorchTech. So there's going to be a networking breakfast for our IT managers community practice, and that'll be on December 3rd. And then the second annual IT Unmeeting is happening on January 15th. So make a note of those two events, December 3rd and January 15th, and there will be more details coming. If you're not signed up to the TorchTech mailing list, sign up to the TorchTech mailing list. So that's that. I want to say a couple of thank yous, particularly to the TorchTech Steering Committee, who helps to keep all of these events on track and to prioritize the information that's coming in about what the community wants and to produce events that are really relevant and useful to your time. Also the CIO Council, ITS, the Wagner School of Public Service, the Silver School of Social Work, Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, NYU Libraries, and NYU TV all contributed to producing this event today. In particular, I really want to thank Roddy Austin from NYU TV, Robert Allen Knight from Steinhardt, Evan Silberman from Silver, Carrie Mantione from Wagner, Lucy Apert, who was previously with Liberal Studies but has unfortunately left us to join Columbia University, and Keith Whiteman, June Wu, and Sherry Halter, all from ITS. We're going to actually be having this hopefully be a pretty informal event. So Jessica's going to open with some comments, and then we really want to open it up for questions and answers. And Carrie and June are going to have mics once she finishes her remarks, and we're really looking to hear what you want to think about and what you want to talk about in terms of how technology is changing the way that we work. Then, to get even more informal, we're going to be having drinks right next door after everything wraps up, so I hope that you can stay for a little while and spend some time talking to your colleagues and building the people network part of this. So that's it with that. Let me introduce Jessica Lawrence. So Jessica is the executive director of the New York Tech Meetup, which is the largest meetup in the world. It's a 33,000 member organization, and in fact, she's leaving here tonight to go and do a New York Tech Meetup event in the Skirball Center, which is 850 seats, and unfortunately it is sold out, so you can't go. Other than the New York Tech Meetup and monthly meetings, she's also spearheaded a variety of other initiatives, in particular post-Hurricane Sandy, bringing members of the New York technical community together with state, federal, and local organizations to help get their critical IT infrastructure back up and running. Prior to New York Tech Meetup, she was the CEO of the Girl Scouts of San Gorgonio Council in Southern California. During her tenure, it became the first nonprofit organization in the country to migrate to a results-only work environment. And it was selected by the Nonprofit Times as one of the 50 best nonprofits in the country to work for. She has been listed as one of the Crain's New York Business People to Watch in Silicon Alley 2013. Her work has appeared in the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, The Next Web, The Daily Muse, and she's been featured in the New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Crain's New York Business, The Huffington Post, and actually a really long list of others. So I'd like to welcome Jessica.
Thank you. Thanks so much. All right, I'm going to migrate back and forth kind of behind the podium so I can move slides, but thank you all so much for having me here. And as Max said, I'm the executive director of New York Tech Meetup. Have any of you ever been to a New York Tech Meetup monthly meetup before? Raise your hands. Awesome. So a number of you. So you know what those meetups are like. And I will be trying to hang around as long as I can for the happy hour afterwards, although, as she said, I have to get downstairs because we'll start to prep all of our demoers for tonight at 5:30. So New York Tech Meetup, we're the biggest meetup in the world. We actually have over 35,000 members now. We grow by about 600 members a month. And we are also a nonprofit organization. So most people know us for our monthly meetup. But on top of doing our monthly meetup, we do a number of other events and activities in the community. We work a lot with trying to engage more women in tech. I'm working right now with some of the computer science high schools in the city. So lots of work all around the tech community. But what I'm here to talk to you about today, and I could do a whole long talk about New York Tech Meetup and the tech community and the tech industry, but we're here to talk about work and technology. And I have kind of a long history, in fact, my entire career, of really thinking about work. And I'm going to share with you the story of my own personal relationship with work, I think our relationship as a society with work, and how technology is influencing all of those things. And I've been passionate about work. I mean, I've been working in the nonprofit sector for 10, 11 years, and almost more than anything else, more than thinking about management and fundraising and human resources, I've found myself thinking about and maybe slightly obsessing over our human relationship with work. How work fits into our lives, whether it makes us happy or doesn't, whether it makes us feel fulfilled, how email changes our habits and our psychology. And thinking about this has inundated my life so much that I actually almost derailed my now fiance's planned proposal, because minutes before he was about to propose, I went into a rant about email and its connection to Groundhog Day and Gantt charts. And luckily, he understands why I'm passionate about this and asked me anyway. But it is something that I can't stop thinking about in many ways. And I think a lot of that is the fact that work has such a profound impact on our lives. If you think about it, there isn't much else that helps put a roof over our heads, that helps keep food in our stomachs, that gives us something that helps provide us fulfillment and meaning and happiness. But I think what's interesting about work is that we keep looking for these things, fulfillment and meaning and happiness more and more, and finding consistently that we're not finding those things all the time in work. And Gallup just did a recent survey and found that only 22% of us are engaged and thriving at work. And you could argue that we're actually working more than ever before, that we have lots more tools at our disposal, but there are only 22% of us that are engaged and thriving. And you think about the fact that that statistic is true under the sort of picture of the fact that we spend a full third of our entire life working. If you take all the seconds that we're alive on this planet, we spend 1/3 of that time doing work. So it seems like we should be able to do something about this number and fix this number. So a lot of my background and a lot of the story that I'm going to share with you is about that kind of ebb and flow of my relationship with work, ways that I've tried to change things, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, and how I've seen technology integrated with all of this. So my first stop in my career journey was far away from the New York tech community and was at a very different organization. I started in my first job out of college at the Girl Scouts in Southern California as a fundraising associate. And Girl Scouts, the way it's structured, there's a national organization that is actually located here in New York, and they charter local Girl Scout councils to provide direct programming to girls. So I was in charge of fundraising for one of those Girl Scout councils. And when I tell most people that I worked at Girl Scouts, they expect me to say that the culture of the organization really matched the mission, that it was warm and fuzzy and friendly and this wonderful, happy place to be. And although I would say that it's that way for the girls who are involved in Girl Scouts, as an employee working there, it did not feel that way at all. And I walked into the doors at Girl Scouts and sort of looked around at first and thought like, okay, well maybe this is how work is supposed to be. I don't know, I'm right out of college. Maybe this is what an office is like. But slowly but surely things kept happening that made me realize that the organization didn't trust the people that worked there, and that there was this overlying sense of hierarchy and command and control and lack of autonomy. And it just felt pretty miserable. Our CEO at the time when I started used to have someone stand at the front door with a clipboard to mark us down if we were more than 5 minutes late for our 8 a.m. start time in the morning. It was 2003, but if I wore a skirt, I was expected to wear pantyhose. If we wanted to take off an hour in the afternoon to go to a child's baseball game or see them in a school play, you couldn't just take that hour off. You couldn't just leave work. You had to submit a vacation slip for a half day off because that was the only way that time was allocated. And you had to get your supervisor's approval before you could leave the building. I was doing fundraising, so that usually means lots of chicken served at lunches and dinners. And you'd think that I could make a simple choice about what type of chicken to serve myself. But I wasn't allowed to. I had to ask the CEO what type of chicken we could serve at the fundraising lunch. So these things start piling up, and the wheels in my head keep turning, going, there's something not right here. This doesn't feel right. At the same time, our technology kept everyone very tethered to the office. We only had landline phones. We kept pretty much all of our files in file cabinets. We didn't have enough computers for all of our employees. I often worked off of a typewriter when I first started working. And this wasn't that long ago. But part of this was that even though some of the technology was available to allow us to work away from the office, they were scared. They didn't trust people to access files without being in the confines of that building. So I went through this for about 5 years, kept sticking around because I was able to do enough interesting work, kept moving up in the organization, and after seeing 4 CEOs cycle through the organization before I took over, I realized when I stepped into that CEO position that I had a lot to change. I looked around and membership had been declining for 10 years. We had unhappy staff, and we had lack of productivity and lack of innovation kind of throughout the organization. So I started thinking to myself, okay, what can I do to change this? And I had heard a lot about flexible work environments and trying to change the way that we let employees work. So I came up with this first idea, and the first idea was that we were going to offer a flexible work program to employees of a certain level and above. They had to apply, they had to be at a manager or director level, and it was only for working from home 1 day a week. And shortly before I was about to launch this program, one of our lowest paid employees comes up to me and says, Jessica, I have a question. I said, okay, what? And she said, why is it that the highest paid people in the organization get to save money on gas and commuting costs by working from home 1 day a week, but people like me, people who need it the most, aren't allowed to take advantage of this? Do you trust us less? I was speechless. I'd never thought about it like that before. And I'm still grateful to that person for, in that moment, changing my understanding of the dynamic between an employer and an employee. So I realized that in there I needed to do something bigger. We needed to change that dynamic of trust within the organization so that no one ever had to ask me a question like that again, that they all could understand that they were trusted. Luckily, I came across this book just a few weeks later. And I picked it up in the airport bookstore because it had the word sucks in the title. And I had just had all of these realizations that this world of work that had been built, that I had entered into, that so much of it didn't make sense to me. And I wanted to figure out a way to change it. So I actually read the book cover to cover on one plane ride, and I ended up, when I got off the plane, calling our director of HR and saying, get this book, we're doing this. And what Why Work Sucks and How to Fix It outlines is how 2 women, Callie and Jody, transformed part of Best Buy's corporate headquarters into what they call a results-only work environment, or ROW. The underlying concept of a ROW is that you work wherever you want, whenever you want, as long as the work gets done. If you think back to the CEO sending someone to the front door with a clipboard to mark down who was 5 minutes late, this could not have been more opposite from that. Within a month, we were the first nonprofit in the country to implement the results-only work environment. And what this did was fundamentally shift that relationship between employer and employee. Instead of saying that we trusted employees, we showed them that we did by giving them control of their time. At the same time, it also shifted how we thought about trust in every other aspect of the organization. So if you're giving people control of their time, and you're telling them they can work from wherever they want, then only offering them desktops and landline phones and metal file cabinets doesn't really support having an organization that says it trusts its employees. So at the same time, we also did a massive technology overhaul and deployed laptops and deployed cell phones and put more of our information and data in the cloud. And we really had to stop and ask ourselves, what does trust mean in our organization? And when we combined all of those things together, what we found is that employees were more engaged. Employees were more productive. We got more done in 1 year after this switch than I had seen us get done in the previous 5 years combined. And not only that, but employees were happier. They were exercising. Collectively, as a staff, we lost more than 400 pounds because for the first time, people felt that they could control their time enough to stop at the gym before they came into work, or take a little bit of time at the end of the day to go for a jog. It certainly wasn't perfect. There were definitely still cultural challenges with the organization, but it proved a very significant point to me and really set me up for questioning every aspect of work as I moved forward. And the big realization that I had was that every aspect of work that we have come to take as truth is something that we actually constructed. So I used to think about the sort of constructs of work as a law of nature, like gravity, like we can't change it, that it exists a certain way and that's how it is. Going through all of this proved to me that we made up all of this stuff. We made up the 40-hour work week. We made up the fact that we work from Monday through Friday, usually from 9 to 5. We made up the fact that we allocate vacation time to people. And if we made up all of these things, and oftentimes made them up not that long ago, 50 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, it means that we can decide to change these things. Keeping in mind as well that most of these things were made up long before the computer existed, long before the internet existed. They were made up for a different time in our work evolution. So if we can make work different, if we can choose to do it in a different way, then why haven't we changed it? Why are we still in that place where 22% of us, only 22% of us, are engaged and thriving at work? And there are a lot of reasons, I think, for that. But to me, one of the core fundamental underlying reasons is that we have this ongoing kind of societal and internal conflict with the way we feel like we should engage with work, with the place that work holds in our lives. I think if we look back historically on the sort of pro-work side, if you go back to 1904, there was a term that was coined called the Protestant work ethic. And the idea behind Protestant work ethic was that through the suffering that you went through at work, you would reach salvation. So it may really suck right now, person who's working on the assembly line for 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. But guess what? Guess where you're going to get to go at the end? Really convenient tool, right, for anyone who's managing a factory and trying to get people to work 16 hours a day. And we have that, and then couple that with the fact that we went through World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, all times when people really needed work to fulfill their basic needs. If they didn't work, they weren't going to eat. If they didn't work, they wouldn't have a roof over their head. And there was also a significant amount of national pride around all of us working. There was this massive effort to keep the country going, to help the country win the war. And so I think it embedded in us this sense of virtue around hard work. We then fast forward a little bit and we look at the entrepreneurship and business community now, and there's this sort of ethos of those who work more win, and that it's this kind of all or nothing scarcity and competition attitude towards work. And if you think about, too, even from the time we're kids, what do people always ask? A kid, basically, as soon as they can talk and have a concept of jobs, we start asking, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do for work? And we then, through our own experience, get positive and reinforcement around work. We get the most accolades in our lives, usually around the work that we do. I know that even personally, where do I feel the most experiences of flow? Kind of where do I have some of the most positive experiences? Oftentimes that's associated with work. So we have all of that kind of on the pro-work side. And yet now we're being faced with some other kind of conflicting messages. So around the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we started getting more prosperous again. It was about getting happy, and are you fulfilling all of your needs? Positive psychology was born in the late 80s, early 90s. And at the same time that all of that was happening, we also started seeing the death of the pension plan and the death of people joining organized religions to a certain extent. So all of those people that in the early days of Protestant work ethic might have bought into that idea, the percentage of people entering into those organized religions keeps dropping. So you don't necessarily have this big pot of gold, this place of salvation, whether that be a pension plan or heaven, at the end that you're working towards. And with all of this together, we start going, well, I want to be happy now. And we then get told, work is killing us. We're working too hard. We're working ourselves to death. If we sit in an office chair all day long, that's akin to spending our lives smoking. It's so bad for our health. We get told that when we're on our deathbeds, we're not going to wish that we had spent more time working. We're going to wish that we had spent more time with our family and friends. At the same time, we develop habits around work. So one of the habits with work is that work creates this pattern of stress and relief. And when we think about happiness, oftentimes that sense of relief mimics a sense of happiness. So we're stuck, right? We have all of this history and all of this sort of societal pressure around work and that we should work hard. And on the other side, we have all of this new pressure around the fact that work is in fact killing us. So we get into this place where we feel like when we are working, we should stop. And when we aren't working, we should be working. And how do we balance those things out? And we get to the point where at a certain point in our history, the role that work filled was really like the first level of the Maslow's hierarchy. It was about putting food in our stomachs and roofs on our heads. And that maybe you'd get to achieve these things in the long run. But now we're kind of expecting the Maslow's hierarchy to be condensed. We want this whole package all at once, all at the same time. And we usually hope and want to try to find that through work. So we have conflicts. That's supposed to say, oh, the L's down there. I think the font changed when we loaded it on. So we have these conflicts at the societal, organizational, and individual level. At the societal level, it's about us having this realization now where we say, this thing that we've been championing, this thing that we've been saying, is a core American virtue of hard work, that thing may be causing a fair amount of collateral damage. And what should we do about that? And then at the organizational level, I think this is where we get more granular in terms of how is tech impacting how work is changing. And there's nothing more symbolic of that than the office. So if you think back to when offices became popular, they had a specific utility. It wasn't a just because kind of thing. It was that in order to get work done, you had to go where the equipment to do that work was located. And because of the type of equipment that you had, the only place that you could go, the only place that companies could afford to put this equipment was in one physical location. So all of these women came in to work on these machines. They couldn't necessarily afford to have one of these at home. They had to be physically with the other people so they could hand deliver things back and forth. If you wanted to make a phone call at a certain point, it relied on having operators sitting at a bank of little holes where they'd plug things in the wall to connect you to whoever you were trying to talk to. We didn't have an option other than an office. But what having a physical location did was create a habit for us of measuring the baseline of an employee's performance on whether they showed up here or not. It was a shortcut. So these women showed up, so check mark. They did the basic thing that they need to do for their job. There may be some other things on top of that that get measured. But that shortcut made us feel really, really comfortable because at least we knew that all of these seats were filled. And it was a bit of a mirage, but we also believed that we could kind of control everything that was happening here because it was all under one roof. We could see everything that was going on within our organization. And then technology comes in. And all of a sudden, people can work anywhere. That metal file cabinet sitting in the corner can now be an icon in the cloud. You can make a phone call from any phone or computer from just about anywhere in the world. So now this shortcut that we had created for measuring our employees' performance to a certain extent, that foundation is starting to crack a little bit. And you can't sort of tell employees anymore that you have to have an office because that's where all of the equipment is. There are some cases in which that's still true, but for the majority of people who are kind of working in the knowledge field, that's not really true anymore. And it really then gets to the heart of what I had an awakening on earlier in my story, which is that shaking and cracking this foundation puts us in a place where the relationship between the employer and the employee is fundamentally different. And we have to start asking ourselves more questions about trust. Because in the office where you could see what everyone was doing, even if it was a little bit of a false construct, you sort of felt like you trusted people, or at least you had control over them. And trust and control are not the same things, although they both make us feel kind of comfortable. Someone who's managing a company and feels like they have control because everyone's in this single space, they feel pretty comfortable with that. So when you start loosening that grip of control, they stop feeling comfortable, and all of a sudden fear starts to sneak in. And what I experienced at Girl Scouts was that every time we tried to introduce something that was new, when we introduced the results-only work environment, we were met with a barrage of what ifs. What if people can't be trusted to make their own decisions? What if people will slack off? What if this person will take advantage of the new open vacation policy that we have? What if this person will show up wearing pajama bottoms at work? Which was actually like one of the big concerns, was that people would show up at work in pajamas. That if all of a sudden we said you can manage your own time, that people would like lose it and no longer remember how to be adults. And my answer to those what ifs is actually yes. To a certain extent, all of that stuff happened. We had someone who maybe took a little bit too much advantage of vacation time. We had someone who slacked off a bit. And yes, we even had someone who showed up in pajama bottoms. But those are the exact same people who slacked off, who showed up in pajama bottoms, and who took advantage of vacation time before we changed the way that we work. They were the people who, yes, would show up at the office on time, but would spend half their day watching cat videos on YouTube. So the problem wasn't with the structure of the work environment. It turned out that the problem was with the employee. If you have a slacking employee, they're most likely going to slack no matter what environment you put them in. And the fact that you have them in a room and you can kind of watch them means nothing. They can still sit and stare into space. And so the idea that giving employees more autonomy was going to ruin everything caused so much fear. But the fear was really, truly unfounded. So when I started thinking about, what other things does technology impact, one of the things that we saw it impact the most was how managers manage and how employees manage themselves. And I think one of the ways that technology does that is that technology kind of warps time, and it changes the way that we connect time to work. So even though in the past, many people probably grumbled about the 9-to-5 workday because it was very restrictive in the sense that you were supposed to be creative and productive between 9 and 5 and no other time. But the one thing that it did do was at least set parameters. And before we had the technology to be always on all the time, even if you had a pretty jerky boss, that boss couldn't email you at 3 o'clock in the morning. And they probably weren't going to call you at 3 o'clock in the morning. So we all knew that for the most part, we usually got a break where we couldn't do work and we weren't expected to be on. So I think how that changes then the manager's role is that as a manager, you have to become more cognizant of how you role model and how your working behavior influences the people that you manage. So I had an employee when we switched to results-only work environment who was constantly emailing her staff at 3 o'clock in the morning because that was when she felt like working. And her staff actually came to me and said, we don't know what to do. We feel like we're supposed to respond. She's working at 3 o'clock in the morning. Are we supposed to be working at 3 o'clock in the morning? And I said, absolutely not. That's not part of the game. Like, you don't have to mirror what your boss does. But them asking me that question sent a big signal that said, we probably have to think a little bit differently about how we work and how, as a manager, that work impacts the people who are watching us. Because to a certain extent, it doesn't matter if a supervisor says, yeah, I'm going to email you at 3 o'clock in the morning or at 10 a.m. on a Sunday, but just ignore it. Don't pay attention to it. I know you're carrying your phone around and you can see that I emailed, but just pretend it didn't come in. Right. I mean, most employees who are trying to stay on top of things are not going to just ignore it. And if they do just ignore it, they're going to feel guilty. And this is where we get into that tug of war with work, where we're constantly feeling like if we're off, we should be on, and if we're on, we should be off. Same thing with vacation time. If a manager never takes vacation and yet tells their employees, yeah, you go ahead, you should definitely use your vacation time, the employee is not ever going to feel like it's okay for them to go on vacation. And this leads into, I think, another core component that I've learned about how technology and that fact that we can always be on impacts each of us individually. And that is, on top of managers having to really change their behavior, we have to think about how the locus of responsibility changes under this sort of new umbrella of technology, which is that in the past, as individual employees, what we had to do was relatively well defined for us. If we showed up on time, check, that was the initial thing that we did right. And we knew we were supposed to stay at work up until a certain hour, and we knew after that that we were kind of done for the day. And we didn't really have to think about, on a sort of moment-to-moment basis, how we were managing the intersection of work with the rest of our lives. But now that we have access and ability to work all of the time, we've had to become better managers of ourselves. And I had a Friday night recently where I was at home working at my computer, 7 p.m. on a Friday night, responding to email. And I thought, this really is not great. Why am I doing this? Who told me that I have to work at 7 p.m. on a Friday night? And then I was like, oh, right. I told me that I have to respond to email at 7 p.m. on a Friday night. And I think, even if you're in a situation where you have managers above you and you have people who are somewhat telling you or modeling for you when you're supposed to be working, each of us does have, no matter what really the situation is, we do have opportunities to make decisions and even little micro decisions about what we're doing with our time. And we've gotten so much into the habit of constantly working and constantly focusing on the new messages that are coming in on our devices that we, to a certain extent, have let that ratio between work and other things that happen in our life get a little bit off balance. And you end up then sometimes having this realization that you really want to get mad at the jerky boss that you have. And maybe you really do have a jerky boss, and if that's the case, then sometimes the only thing you can do is try to get away from that jerky boss. But there are other times when you wake up and realize that that jerky boss is you. And if you ever had to work for a boss like you, you'd quit. And that almost no matter what your situation is in terms of who you work for and how your work is structured, you have the opportunity to be a better boss to yourself and to think differently about how work intersects with the other parts of your life. So I recently did I was curious about how I had spent the last 11 years of my working life. And this is an estimate, but I think it's relatively accurate. So I figured out that I've worked for about 29,000 hours. I've slept for about 26,000 hours. Spent time with family and friends for about 12,000 hours. Exercised for a measly 562 hours and meditated maybe for 15 hours. So, a lot of people are really quick to dismiss the concept of work-life balance, and I hate that term, in fact, because work and life are not two separate things. They are all part of the same thing, and the 50-50 part doesn't make any sense, because I feel like those ratios change all the time. At the same time, though, when I did this breakdown, I was a little bit amazed at the space between how many hours I had worked and how many hours I had spent with friends and family. And it's interesting because if you actually look back to the messages that a lot of the unions put out when they were trying to really push for the 40-hour work week early in the 20th century, they used to break it down by saying 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for whatever you'd like to do. And that breakdown was probably a little bit healthier than what most of us do now. And I realized that, even though I've done very fulfilling work, and I love my work, that I eat like crap most of the time, and I don't really exercise that much, and I only manage to call my parents usually once a week. And if I keep going in this ratio, I probably will regret it at some point. I probably will regret that I didn't make some more intentional decisions about how I structured work and the rest of my life. But I think this is the key thing that goes back to that conflict. That to me, you could look at this and say, well, Jessica, you need to quit your job because obviously you've already maxed out the sort of work component of this whole work-life thing. And a lot of people do. They're sort of getting into this idea that let me quit my job and do whatever I'm passionate about because that's the best way for me to accomplish a better ratio of this. And I don't necessarily believe that because I've found so much fulfillment and so much enjoyment out of having a job, out of working somewhere, out of the relationships that I build with the people that I work with. But I do think it requires that we be a bit more intentional about the choices that we make related to work and the rest of our lives. So, I can choose to get up in the morning and instead of flipping open my computer and diving right into email, I can make a conscious choice to spend 10 minutes meditating. When I get home from work, instead of opening my computer back up again, I can make a conscious choice to spend 30 minutes calling my parents. At the same time, though, because I do absolutely see the value of work in my life, I can also choose to sometimes stay up late into the night because I'm working on a project that really excites me and that my brain is on fire until I get this out of me and get this project done. I don't think this is a duality that we have to solve. I think it's something that if we add more intention and purpose to both sides of it, at both the individual level and at the organizational level, we can get to a better, more holistic relationship with work and the rest of our lives. And just sort of concluding here, thinking about technology as a tool. Most tools that we've ever invented have a light side and a dark side. A tire can be found on an ambulance that's rushing you to the hospital to save your life, and it can also be found on the getaway car, criminals who just committed a crime. And we're in the same position with technology. We can deploy it for good, or we can deploy it for things that are not so good. And I think for us as a society, we have to start thinking about how we view and celebrate work a little bit differently. As organizations, we have to start thinking about how we trust employees. And as employees of organizations, we have to start thinking more about how we manage ourselves, given the context of being in a world that is filled with technology that gives us so much opportunity, but that has a kind of dark side if we don't harness it right. And after all of this exploration of work and how it intersects with our lives, I've never been more enamored with the possibility that we have. I think technology enables us to potentially get to that point where that Maslow's hierarchy is condensed, and that all of us are getting to the point where we can have work that both puts food in our stomachs and a roof over our heads and gives us that meaning and fulfillment and happiness that we're looking for. Thank you.
That was terrific, Jessica.
Thank you.
It's a lot to think about, and it's really, it has so much to do with our identity and how we interact with our work and that aspect of our identity. We may have a couple of bar stools to sit down, or we may not.
I'm fine with standing.
I think we're standing.
All right.
Well, I'm gonna kick off the Q&A with actually sort of one observation myself. Just looking at the photograph of the women on typewriters in the big room made me think about when I started managing. I had 2 people who worked for me, and I think maybe 2 months into it, I sort of did a drive-by and looked at what was going on in their desks, and I walked by the one, and she was shopping for shoes on Zappos. It was like 1:30 in the afternoon, and I was like, well, you know, and I walked by the other one, and he was putting together his baseball fantasy team. And I freaked out. I was like, I am the worst manager ever. I am now going to have to yell at them.
Thank you.
And then I took kind of a quiet moment. It's like, actually, they're finishing all their work. Like, there's nothing that I can think of that they're not actually getting done.
Yep.
And it made me realize, like, okay, part of their brain is working on that problem. Part of their brain is still programming. They're just taking that step back from the code.
Yep.
So yeah, that trust thing.
Yeah.
So I have sort of a specific question. On the website for TorchTech, we got some questions before you arrived. And one of them I think about because I just came back from a vacation. I've read 600 of the 1,200 emails that were in my inbox when I returned. And one of my big questions is, do you think that people are going to be reading less email going forward? Do you think that there are other tools, other workplace communication methods that are more prevalent?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've seen is that, I right now run a very small organization. It's me and one other employee. So, but even with just the 2 of us, it's interesting. We have an office, but we usually only go in like 2 days a week, 3 days a week maybe. And when we're not there, we try not to email each other too much. We use GChat. And I know lots of other organizations with more employees that tend to use something like Skype or another chat tool to kind of keep open what they call the water cooler all the time, just to sort of share things back and forth so it's not adding to people's inboxes. And I think there are some people that are starting to potentially try to use things like Twitter as a communication tool versus email. I just met someone the other day who said he's off his inbox completely and he's only communicating with people through Twitter, which was kind of the first time that I had heard someone so adamantly saying they aren't emailing. But I don't see it being a tool that's necessarily going to completely go away anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it also becomes sort of a means of documenting our work and our decisions, and that's one of the places where I haven't seen Skype or Twitter really fill in that, like, oh, what did we decide 3 months ago?
Yeah, and I think, there are some sort of group collaboration tools like Podio or Basecamp that oftentimes have more of that chat feature where they'll log the communications that you've had back and forth, so you can kind of search for some of the things that you've talked about in the past in a way that mimics email a little bit.
Oh, that's something to explore.
Yeah, yeah.
Then a second question that I have relates actually to my team, so it's much larger now. But as a programmer managing programmers, you can imagine it's kind of male, not a lot of women. And I have 3 young dads who have a lot of family obligations. We've seen some shifts happen to help support women who have to manage family obligations. Have you seen anything change in the technical industry and in organizations you work with about how they support dads?
Well, I think it's interesting because at least from what I've seen in the tech startup community, I was actually just recently sort of working on our own personnel policies, and I asked our attorney to send me the sample of what he would usually give a tech startup. And I'm looking through it and going, there's nothing in here about maternity or paternity or childcare leave, like nothing. And I was just like, wow, do we really expect that no one in the tech industry is ever going to have a family? Like, this is nuts. And so I think what I've actually seen from some organizations is that they try to keep it away now from being just a women's issue altogether, that it's an issue of being a caregiver for a child. And so whether you're male or female, you still may be taking on that role as being a primary caregiver. So the way that I've seen it actually phrased in policies is instead of being mother and father, it's phrased as primary caregiver for a child that has been recently born or adopted.
I saw Van's hand go up. June, can you bring him a mic? And yeah, anybody else who's got some questions or thoughts?
So, Jessica, I think the question is...
Oh, Van, let me make sure that it's on. Just hold it a little closer because we are recording. Yep.
So the question is that we've shifted a lot from industrial type work environments to like this knowledge worker type work environment. And with that shift, I think you talked a little bit about the difference in motivation systems that have happened. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of curious because I feel like what we've seen is that the kind of knowledge worker supports being able to kind of have results-only workplace environments. But these kind of industrial assembly line stuff, all of the motivation systems they had in place, they worked for that. How do you basically deal in a mixed organization? How do you approach that where you kind of have still industrial workers that are kind of doing a cookie cutter task, and then you have the folks that need to do the creative thinking, and how do you approach that from a policy standpoint, or how have you seen or thought of people?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what's challenging in our country right now is in a lot of ways labor laws have not kept up with the way that we actually work. So one of the things that we experienced at Girl Scouts was we had exempt salaried employees who did not have to clock their time, and oftentimes they were in the more sort of knowledge-based work jobs. And then we had employees who were hourly employees who had to clock their hours, who were oftentimes, they were doing maintenance on properties. They were doing those more sort of you have to be in a physical location to take care of it type of job. And it was challenging because we had this overall policy of like, we're not counting hours anymore. And yet, because of labor law, I had to tell the employees who worked on an hourly basis, you have to log all of your hours. So what we did in a lot of ways was try to, as much as possible, help support the people who had less choice about where they could physically work. So for instance, the receptionist that worked at the front desk, we trained our entire staff to know how to answer the phone. And we sort of worked it out amongst the staff to, if she needed to take time off, if she needed to take her child to the doctor, that we had 50 potential people that could fill in for her while she left. And that helped a bit with that group of staff not feeling kind of that they were being treated differently than the other group of staff. I think in terms of motivation, I think one of the things that sort of thinking differently in general about autonomy and trust and all of those things does is that it helps work be a little bit more individualized. So we shifted to this work environment where you could work wherever you want, whenever you want. I had a couple of employees who actually came to me and said, well, does this mean I can't come into the office from 9 to 5? I kind of like getting away from my husband, like he works at home. And so, I said, no, still come into the office between 9 and 5. And some of them, that was what they felt comfortable with. And that was actually what motivated them. They liked being present in the office. And I think that level of motivation does vary from person to person and from job to job. I mean, I was just talking to someone the other day who they were talking about an incentive plan that was rolled out in the company that they work. And it was, sell this many tickets to an event that we're doing, and you'll get a percentage of the sales. And there was one person on the team who was like, yes, I'm doing it. I want to get the money. There was another person on the team who was motivated by not wanting to disappoint her fellow employees. And there was a third person on the team who was like, what are you talking about? I would work that hard anyway, even if you didn't incentivize me. But I think having that mindset of thinking about the individual employees as sort of complicated human beings as opposed to, I think the old industrial mindset is they're interchangeable parts. And the interchangeable parts all follow the same prescription. You give them this, this, and this, and they'll be happy and they'll keep working. And for the most part, there are some underlying fundamental core things about trying to give people meaningful work, trying to give them some control of their time as much as possible, compensating them fairly. But outside of that, there are a million different motivations.
We have a nearly, I think, 24/7 help desk now, so anyone can call in from any of our locations.
Yeah.
And there has to be somebody on that line when they call in. And I know there are some interesting things that have been done about permitting people to clock in and clock out very quickly. So they can do something as simple as take a phone call, like a personal phone call.
Yep.
While making sure that we have a really good level of service for the university.
Yep.
So, but I think that's a really big challenge, is where there's that time associated work, or where it's punching cables. You have to be where the cable is.
Right.
David, Carrie, can you get David a mic?
So first of all, that was a great talk. Thank
Thanks.
you. I did the math on your sleep, and you're sleeping 6.5 hours a night. And I read an article a couple years ago in the New York Times that said people who sleep 7 hours a night live the longest. So just get that up 30 minutes. You're going to be great. Having become the boss who was sending email all weekend and all evening, I recently decided to do an experiment with my directors. And I stopped sending, I made a new rule for myself. I published it in Google Drive. And basically the rule said, no email during certain hours, basically weekends and nights, unless it's urgent, that someone needs to respond to during a weekend or a night, because people are responsible to fix things 24/7, right? So you can't completely shut it off. And I posed this to my directors, and I said, I'm not ordering everyone to stop, but it might be nice if people kind of went along, and maybe this could become infectious in the organization. And what happened was the directors never stopped. So, they just kept sending the mail on the weekends and the evenings. And now I look like I'm the only one not working, right? But the truth is, or my question is, do I need to take a step where I enforce that as a rule? And in fact, my extended leadership team is going to be exposed to this tomorrow at 12 o'clock. One of our items is going to be to discuss this. But I think it could be infectious if an organization really, everyone decides, okay, unless it really needs to be reacted to. So, but if I mandate that, do I look like the other boss that you described, that jerk?
No, I think, this is where technology comes in and is actually helpful. Because the argument that I used to get was, yeah, but my time that I'm most on with work, or the time that I have free that I'm not taking care of my kids, is in the middle of the night. That's when I have to email, or I have to catch up on the weekend. But the truth is that there are multiple programs out there, like a program called Boomerang, that will let you draft all your emails and then send them later. And even if you don't have access to that, pretty much every email program on the planet allows you to write a draft and hit the send button later.
Right,
so,
and our Google Mail, actually, when you write an email, it's automatically in the drafts within seconds.
Right,
and that's
right.
what I'm doing. I'm just letting stuff sit in the drafts, and then Monday morning or the next morning, I release them.
Yeah, and I don't think that there is anything wrong. I think that that's actually great to say that you have some parameters, so that, and because this also deals with the issue of the false urgency of email, because with email, it feels like every email is someone knocking on your door, and until you go to answer it, it's not going to leave you alone. And so if you can say, look, I'm not going to knock on your door unless it's urgent, and I expect all of you not to be knocking on each other's doors unless it's urgent, I think some of the shift in terms of trusting people more and creating a different type of organization doesn't mean that you shouldn't have any parameters for doing things. One of the things that I'm going to be writing into our new personnel policies is that we expect you to take at least 3 weeks of vacation a year. And that like we'll actually get mad at you if you don't take your vacation versus the other way around. So I think, you know, and sometimes because we have so many habits and we've developed some pretty bad habits of how we work, putting a policy in place that counteracts that would probably be the best thing that you could do.
Laura.
I just have an add-on.
Sorry, Laura, let me make sure that you're mic'd because we're recording.
So David, I think that when it comes to email, I think what Jessica said is important. The mom that can only do, or dad that can only do their email at midnight is, so be it, but it's about expectations. So, and I think it's expectations on the side of the sender and your expectation on for the receiver. So for example, everybody I work with knows that between midnight and 6, I'm asleep. And they can send me all the email they want, it's not going to wake me up. So as long as David knows that he's not going to hear from me till 8 in the morning, that could be something that you establish in your organization where you can send all the email you want, but we're going to respond, or I'm going to respond between 8 a.m. and midnight and not any other time. So I think that there are expectations that we set for ourselves and for each other, and you could tweak those and maybe not so much have an order that says you can't send email between midnight and 8.
I don't know, I would argue that psychologically, it doesn't matter what expectation you've set up, my brain is going to tell me that you're working harder than I am because you're up at midnight sending email. And it doesn't matter if you told me 1,000,000 times that you do that because you're taking care of your kids between 3 and 6 when I'm sending email, my brain is going to say, I need to do that too. And that's why I've sort of become more of an advocate of the save stuff in drafts, use a send later function, because I think that as much as sometimes that may work, our own brains kind of take over and do their own thing in terms of, and I think sometimes what happens too is that creates just a little fracture of, you know, a little bit of jealousy, a little bit of competition, and sometimes that fracture can keep widening when more things start happening kind of on top of that initial little crack.
So we have another question. I know you're from the School of Medicine, but I forgot.
Yes, I am. Yes, I'm from the School of Medicine. Just a question. I would like, if you can share your thoughts about the potential mistakes that schools are making right now, deploying technologies for the kids. And can you also comment what the mistakes are the teenagers doing right now, you know, by using technology, spending all the time with
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting about kids, and I forget, I think I was listening to WNYC or something, and they had a story about how, you know, 1 and 2-year-olds know how to turn on iPads and find everything more than probably a lot of 40 or 50-year-olds do. And it's kind of amazing that they're born at this point almost knowing how to use this technology. And so, you know, I think it does, we have to find that middle ground, because telling kids to not use the technology that they now are sort of born knowing how to use and see as a total asset and see as, you know, almost another part of their body doesn't make a lot of sense all the time. But I think it is about making sure that they're using it for good and not, there is a point where they can be overusing it. And I think a lot of that comes from modeling by parents. And there's a woman named Sherry Turkle who talks a lot about this idea of, you know, the kid seeing their parent at the soccer game, and their parent is staring down at their phone or their BlackBerry responding to email, not watching the kid play soccer. And in the child's mind, it sets this idea that, like, the most important things are always happening in the device. And I think that there is something that we do need to kind of model around the idea that, yes, there's important stuff that happens in these devices, and they enable us to do many amazing things, but there is lots of other important work that happens and important things that happen in our lives outside of those devices.
So I know that Keith has a question back there.
I support one of the ULT members for the university, and I find myself constantly checking email, even at times when I should be with my family, at night. It's the first thing I check in the morning. Do you have any tips for how I can disconnect?
Yeah, so I assume that this tool would work for you, but there's a great program called Wayfind that, you know, I for a long time was the solo employee of New York Tech Meetup, which like made me be in the same position, and now I'm one of 2 employees. So I have one other person working with me, but I'm still sort of constantly on guard for like, well, what if some email comes in that needs to be answered? There's no one else to see it. So a Wayfind, what it does is if you set it up with your email, if someone uses urgent in the subject line of an email, or you can set it up to alert you when certain people have emailed you. So say like the chairman of our board of directors, when he emails me, I get a text message. So I don't have to be sitting in my inbox all the time. So I've actually gotten to the point where I turn off my work inbox on the weekend, because I know that if someone needs me urgently and they put urgent in either the subject line or actually I think in the body of the email, I'll get a text message. If my board chair emails me, I'll get a text message. And it has solved that problem of me constantly feeling like, okay, is anything urgent happening? Is anything urgent happening? And I can put my phone away. And you know, and I think auto reply has also been a bit of a lifesaver for me too, in terms of I'll put in the auto reply if you need to get a hold of me urgently. And I actually define urgently in the auto reply, because when I first started using it, I didn't do that. And people would email me with something that was definitively not urgent, like something that was happening, you know, 4 weeks from now that was really not all that important to either of us. And they would email me, get my auto reply, see that there was another way to contact me, and then hit the button to contact me urgently. And so I put in the definition, like, urgently means that if you don't hear back from me within the next 24 hours, everything is going to fall apart. And once people started reading that, they stopped using the urgent thing when it wasn't really urgent. But I think a Wayfind for me has been one of the biggest lifesavers, and allowing myself to then turn off my actual inbox on my phone when I need to be with my family. And for me too, vacations, other things. I mean, I have taken 2 weeks of vacation at a time while working for New York Tech Meetup, and I just set up in advance who was going to cover things. We have volunteers on our board that covered things. I had a massive auto reply that answered the top 10 questions that you might be emailing me about, and then I was just offline. You know, one person had a way of getting a hold of me if all hell was breaking loose. But other than that, no one could get in touch with me.
So maybe just one more question before we go to drinks. Sharon. I'm realizing I think I know like 70% of you. Hi, it's nice to see you.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
You talked about how a CEO could change the environment, and David talked about how a manager. How about an employee? How could they influence an environment, make it more flexible, get the trust of their boss?
Yeah, so I think, you know, that's always a hard question, and I think it depends a bit on who your supervisor is, who the boss is, who's in charge, because I have run across supervisors that come hell or high water will never change. And it's really hard to be in that situation. But I think that there are ways to change things. One of the ways to change things is to start small. So come up with one idea and present it as an experiment. You know, if you have a supervisor who never lets you work from home, say, can I experiment with working from home one afternoon a week for the next month and see how it goes? Or can our whole team, can we work together to decide who's going to work from home, you know, each afternoon this week? And doing small experiments. And if the experiment works, giving all of the credit to the supervisor and saying basically like, look, like this was an amazing decision you made. Like this worked out great. And giving the supervisor all of the credit. Sure, like it might feel like a little bit like, but I came up with the idea. But if your end goal is to get more of whatever it is that you're seeking, making them feel good about the decision that they made. Some of it too is setting up, you know, parameters in advance for, one of the problems that we had at Girl Scouts was that we really didn't have many ways of measuring performance outside of whether someone showed up at work or not. And so one of the things that we had to do when we switched to results-only work environment was say, how do we measure whether this person's doing their job? How do we measure whether having someone work at home all the time raises or lowers their level of performance? And so some of it too is you might already have some of those parameters in place to be able to do kind of a before and after. But the biggest fear oftentimes for a supervisor is that things are going to get worse when you let go of that control. So if you have a way of showing them that things are getting better or they're at least staying the same, then having that data in hand often goes a long way to making them feel like, okay, I'm not so scared of this anymore. We can try a little bit more of this. The other thing I would say is just like really understanding who the person is that you're working for, because some people are incredibly data driven, and showing them multiple studies and showing them, you know, other people's data about the impact of adding more flexibility to a work environment will help them see it differently. And other people are more sort of like heart-centered in terms of talking about impact on families and like all of those types of things. So knowing sort of which data set or which type of data to deploy to help someone frame their decision making is incredibly helpful too.
Do you have one more question, Van?
So the question really is about the loss in creativity that you have by not having people together. So at Stern, we have an economist, Paul Romer, who talks about urbanization and about the fact that cities are a lot more productive because of the density of ideas kind of intermingling with each other, or I think it's ideas like to have sex.
Yep.
And I'm just kind of curious in terms of like what your thought is in terms of innovation and the productivity that you're losing in the environment by not having people both in the same physical space and time and able to interact, especially because it's a knowledge worker environment and a creative environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge amount of debate about this, right? So, I mean, there's lots of research that brainstorming doesn't work. There's, people that would point to this idea that having people together makes you more creative, but then there are other people that say that if you actually look at when and where people have their most creative kind of light bulb moments, it's actually not when they're in a large group, it's when they're working on their own. And so I think, what the conclusion that we're mostly coming to is that a combination of both is best. Giving employees choice as much as you can is best. So I see a lot of tech companies doing complete open plan offices. And there's a lot of research that says complete open plan, where you see, a sea of a ton of people working and you have no private space, is not the best way to set up an office. On the other hand, having a completely divided space where people never interact is not the best way to set up an office. So, and I think it was Steve Jobs who set up an office space so that there were natural points where people collided, that the bathrooms and the place where you ate and everything was kind of in this central area, so that you did have more of those kind of serendipitous collisions. And I think that those are important. But on the other hand, I think you can look at a lot of companies that have basically grown really amazing products, have built really amazing companies, and mostly have completely dispersed workforces. And they're almost never in the same physical space together. And I think some of that comes from the way that they interact online, how they're using technology tools to stay connected, how they're doing the hiring in the first place in terms of finding people who really identify with the culture of the organization. And I think it is possible to have a culture, even if you're not all in the same physical space. But I think it is, as much as possible, finding that balance and being purposeful and intentional about why you have an office. So, I've had never seen this before, but I saw the personnel policies of a tech company recently, and they actually said, they had a whole section about the purpose of our office. Why do we have a physical space? Our physical space is so that we can celebrate together, so that we can spend time ideating together. And so it's taking that like old model of we have a physical space because that's where the equipment is, to we have a physical space because that's where we do these purposeful things together. And I think that's what employees are kind of expecting now, because they don't buy it. Nobody buys it anymore, like you just have to be here because I said so. Like people, more and more, I think people are going to say like, why? I know that I can work from home just as easily, so you better give me a good reason for why I need to show up in this office and commute into this office every single day. Thank you.